A very warm welcome to the plea webinar. Our guest for this afternoon is Advocate Divya Malcolm, partner, coach, and company. Divya, very warm welcome to the plea webinar.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to thank Plea for doing so much for legal education and awareness. And it's always a pleasure to associate with Plea.
So, Divya, before we begin, I would like you to share with the participants your journey in law.
Well, I started my career in 2006, and to tell you the truth, 2006 was a wonderful time to start your career in, especially in real estate. We had townships coming. We had 3 townships coming up in Pune itself. So there's this place in Pune called Hadapsar. On either side of Hadapsar, we had marvelous townships coming up. Amonora Park, Lavasa. Lavasa was, it's a unique project as far as India is concerned. It's one of the they advertised back then. They used to advertise themselves as the first independent India's first hill station township. Then I had the opportunity of working on special economic zones, ITITS parks, redevelopment of cess buildings, redevelopment of old cooperative society buildings. Currently, unfortunately, because of the slowdown in real estate, a lot of work is in the nature is for affordable housing projects. So when we do a project, most of our assignments consist of doing a thorough due diligence of the property and hand-holding the client through real estate documentation, which includes the entire range of real estate documents, right from your term sheet to your memorandum of understanding, to your agreement for sale, sale deed, to your template agreement for sale of flats, and in case the developer decides to form a condominium. So as far as condominiums are concerned, you have a unique set of documents such as the deed of apartment, the declaration that is required to be filed by the owner and the developer, so on and so forth.
So, Divya, can you highlight the difference between drafting a litigation document and a transactional document? Is there any difference?
Yes, absolutely. The approach of an advocate who specializes in litigation is very different from an approach of a transactional lawyer, because the two work in a completely different environment. A litigation lawyer works in an adversarial environment. What he needs to do when he drafts his documents, he needs to keep in mind the reliefs that he intends to he wants the court to grant, and build up a case towards those relief, highlight his strong points, move from his strongest point to his weakest points, so on and so forth. But as far as transactional lawyers are concerned, they work in an environment of collaboration. It is, and this change in attitude reflects in the documents as well. And it is sometimes the clients to prefer, they prefer to have a transactional lawyer for all their documentation work, because they don't intend to have enter into a confrontation where when the idea is to, the idea is to work with an atmosphere of team spirit rather than rather than enter into unnecessary face-offs. Having said that, it is very important for every transactional lawyer to know how the courts function. Without knowing how the courts interpret documents, it is impossible to come up with foolproof documents. The drafting will always be inadequate in case the lawyers don't know how the courts function.
What do you think should be the checks and balances in drafting of documents, may it be development real estate related or non-real estate related, which a lawyer must keep in mind whilst drafting?
As I said, everybody should have a functional knowledge of how the courts work. In addition to that, the first principles, there are too many statutes, there are too many laws right now. However, in law, there are very few basic principles, and each field has its own nuances. Real estate, documents have their own nuances, but lawyers should be able to foresee a problem and provide for it. Let me give you an example of a development agreement. Now, I have come across development agreements for sharing of revenue, where these days the developers are short of immediate cash, they are short of funds. So instead of making an upfront payment, they promise an area to the contractor. So so that the area can monetize so that the contractor can monetize the area promised to it. Now, in such a contract, if you are for the contractor, you are acting for the other party, not to have a clause against price cutting is not doing justice to your client. Not to have a clause against, because it is quite likely that the developer to mop up funds will start underpricing his stock, and then you're left high and dry. It is quite likely that the developer may say, now I have given you an example of an area share. There are development agreements where instead of promising a demarcated area to the joint developer, the developer promises a share in the revenue. So as and when there's a sale, as and when he sells the premises, the owner or his co-developer gets a share in the revenue. Now it is for the lawyer to foresee that the developer can sell the property, can at a depressed price to its sister concerns, to its own affiliates, and then later on when the party starts squabbling and the matter goes to the court, you can't haul up the litigation lawyer for not getting adequate relief because the document itself is inadequate. So in such a case, you must. I have come across documents where, and development agreements where there are no timelines for completion. No timelines have been stipulated for completion of the project. There is there is absolutely no clause on liquidated damages in case of a delay on the part of the developer. If there is a clause on liquidated damages, the liquidated damages recorded in the document are so nugatory, it hardly has a force of deterrence. So all these issues, it is for the lawyer to think through, to understand the transaction, understand the business of the client, and make a foolproof document. A development agreement is, now this is from the I've given you examples where the owner's interest have been not taken adequately care of. Similarly, there are times when the developer's interests are not taken care of. The developer is not the owner of the property. So when he has to mortgage the property, he has to come back to the owner. There are development agreements where, and it is impossible for any developers to self-finance a project. And there are development agreements where the right to mortgage the property has not been taken by the developer. So it is for the lawyer to understand the business of the client and to foresee all these situations and make a watertight document.
So Divya, can I summarize this by saying two things? That one is, as a lawyer, as budding lawyers, they need to be aware of the law. They also need to be aware of the nuances of the trade, to be able to visualize the checks and balances they need to incorporate in the document. But also they need to be aware of the language and construction of a document, because a word here, wrong here or there, can make all the difference.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Poor language has led to so much of confusion. Sometimes you have to read a document twice over only to understand what is the intention of the parties. And I think a lot of lawyers feel that if they put unnecessary verbiage, or if they use a lot of legalese, the document becomes tighter. In fact, it is counterproductive to use legalese. Let me give you and the use of definitions. I mean, we come across documents where terms which don't, it may be counterproductive to have too many definitions in your document. If you want, I can give you a simple example. So let's start off with any contract. Typically a very simple agreement these days starts something like this. This agreement, and into brackets, here in after referred to as agreement, is made and entered into at Mumbai this 27th day of June, English calendar year 2020, by and between ABC Limited. Now, we have just got started. Is it necessary to define this agreement as agreement? And when you proceed, when you define this agreement as agreement, and especially in real estate documents, you're going to talk about other agreements, you're going to talk about how the property devolved onto the seller or the prospective, or the licensor. In that case, your definition is going to add to the confusion and complicate your life instead of simplifying it. Then English calendar year. I mean, is there any other year other than a calendar year? And I'm completely fascinated by this term, English calendar year. By and between the parties, you can simply say between A and by and between, between A and B. By adding by and between, I don't think you bring greater, your document becomes any better. Then we have just got started. So then you write the registered office, you write the details of, you describe your client, you write the particulars of the parties, and then go on to say recitals. That is okay. But these days, people, many a times, instead of just giving a caption recitals, and you need not even give a caption which sounds mysterious like recitals. Just give a caption background, which can be understood by even a school going child can understand what background means and what kind of information needs to be captured under the caption recitals. Now, instead of simply giving a nice recital, which is a nice caption, which is understood by everybody, most of us start going, you come across documents where there's this winding thing called whereas, and whereas, and whereas, and whereas, and by the time you come to the operative part, everybody has lost interest in the document. In background, what do you need to capture? So you come across agreements. Now we are still stuck at the first page of the document. We come across an agreement where you have hardly started, still there is repetition. You have already defined the parties and the registered office of the parties in the title clause. Under the caption background, you go ahead and write that this agreement is made between ABC, which has this registered office in Fort. That information is there in the title clause. Then you go on to describe property. Now let me give you how the property description, how convoluted the description of property can get. As it is, we capture in the recitals that the full description is given in the schedule. And then you go on to say that the property is delineated in red color on the plan thereof, hereto annexed as annexure A. You don't need all that. You can simply say that the property is delineated in red on the annex plan. So there is a lot of unnecessary verbiage which makes the document, it's difficult for even lawyers to read the document and understand what's happening. I have come across documents where the ABC is defined as ABC. ABC Limited, Private Limited is defined as ABC Private Limited. But somewhere along the line, the draftsman thinks it's more fashionable to refer to ABC as party of the first part, to refer to the second party as to the documents as party of the second part, and then you have party of the third part. So throughout that, you ultimately then the reader makes a legend as to who is party of the first part, who's party of the second part, who's party of the third part. And it becomes really, reading the document itself becomes such a task, let alone determining the intention of the parties and what the actual contract is all about. Now, representations. Most people don't appreciate the difference between representation, warranties, and what should come as a condition precedent. And you have a mishmash of things, right? Even before the document, even before you have got started, whom to make parties to the client. So I can give you examples and examples and examples, and on this point alone, we can have a session of lasting for over an hour.
I would say that number one, use of unnecessary verbiage is to be avoided, and application of the mind while doing is important. But over a period of time, I've always observed that young associates just, for the lack of a better word, copy and paste a previous document which they have seen in their law firm. I'm not sure whether that practice is still prevalent, or I'm not sure it's advisable either, because the nuances are different at each point of time. What is your thought, and what advice do you give to young associates?
Oh, I completely agree with you. In fact, I think Control C and Control V are the two most used functions on anybody's computer. Each transaction is different. You may draw a certain level of inspiration from a precedent, but don't make precedents your Bible, and don't cramp your style. Your precedent may be zilch. You need to, and especially when you are starting your career, what happens is now many people think that such, they have come to replace the word uh, the property with such property. Now such is a pronoun. It's a pronoun which does not bring definitiveness to the document. Such property can be interpreted to mean, are you talking about these kind of properties instead of that very property or a particular property? Now, recently I had a very unhappy case on my platter. As you know, in Bombay, a lot of commercial properties are owned by different investors. So you may have a multinational client who is operating a corporate office from from an area of 10,000 square feet. But the whole of 10,000 square feet consists of different units, and let's say it consists of 5 different units which were amalgamated when the property was taken on leave and license basis by the client at that time. And I'm sure this mistake happened across all the 5 agreements which were executed in favor of the client, because somebody relied on copy paste formula. What happened is the date of execution of the agreement was left blank, and that blank was defined as the effective date. The tenure of the leave and license agreement was computed from the effective date. Now, it's impossible to get 5 different people to execute the document on the same date. So it is for this reason that one document got executed in May, another document got executed in June, and 5 years were computed from the effective date, which was the date of the execution of the document. Ultimately, we were facing a situation where part of the premises, the leave and license agreement for part of the premises expired in May, for another part of the premises expired in June, and for a third part of the premises expired in September. So this is what happens when you rely on cut, copy, paste, you rely on precedents without applying your mind. In this example itself, as far as duration is concerned, duration in all documents relating to real estate, especially leave and license agreement, leases, is very important. So you have a separate clause caption, and I'm a big fan of captions and headings, because these days the simplest of documents runs into 20 pages. Captions and headings and a nice index makes everybody life simpler. If the document is numbered, even when you are negotiating, and a lot of negotiations are going to take place through Zoom. People are not going to go to each other's offices to negotiate a document. You can easily refer to a particular clause. You can go through the document and stick to the discuss and negotiate issue which need to be highlighted and taken up on priority. So if you have a clause where duration is important, have a separate heading or caption called lease term or term duration of the leave and license agreement. Remember, the two are conceptually very different, but I'm aware that on this particular program, people from all over the country have logged in. Leave and license agreement conceptually is different from a lease agreement, but practically a lot of clauses are the same. Now, in these kind of agreement, duration is important. So instead of pegging it to something vague like the effective date, you mention it that the term of the document or the term of the lease or the leave and license year leave and license agreement is 5 years, commencing from so and so date and expiring on so and so date. Because at the time of expiry of the document, a lot of things have to be, the licensor has to be ready with the security deposit, which can be in some posh buildings. The licensors have been collecting as much as 9 months monthly rent as the security deposit. The licensee has to scout for another alternative premises and be ready to move out. It is for this reason that at least the duration of the document should come out crisp. And yes, as I said, arbitration clause. You have certain documents, arbitration clause are just not tenable. Take, I'm tired of coming across arbitration clauses in a mortgage deed because we can talk about mortgage later on. I have a very interesting episode as far as mortgage transaction is concerned. You come across arbitration clauses in a leave and license agreement. You come across arbitration clauses in documents where the courts have been very clear that arbitration is just not applicable or tenable. And right now, there is a raging controversy between on the issue of the difference between seat of arbitration, venue of arbitration, and if you have a different place designated as seat of arbitration and venue of arbitration, what are the legal implications? All these questions, and if you have nominated yet another jurisdiction for applicability of laws, all these ultimately the judges, you're making the life of judges difficult. And sometimes I feel we advocates should take responsibilities for all the pending litigation in our courts. The litigation is pending because the initial transactional advocate didn't do a good job, and because of the inconsistency in the document. There is a tendency amongst advocates to say the same thing in the document several times over. When you mention once is enough. When you mention the same thing several times over, what happens is there's scope of inconsistency. Take, for example, the question of change in the plans. Once you mention change in plans, whatever you want to say about change in plans, say it at one place. No need of having it at all over the place, where even the draft person 1 year down the line finds it difficult to interpret the document. So all these things need to be taken care of, and a lot of these issues arise because of cut, copy, paste.
So a shorter and a crisper document is something which all attorneys should, young advocates, attorneys should actually imbibe, as also quality of the language, verbiage. Can you throw light on typically where should these young associates refer to for some of their drafting, some guidance as to their drafting? Very often seniors are busy with their clients and young associates don't know where to turn to. So Divya, could you give some guidance by way of books which you recommend for drafting of transactional documents?
Well, I can recommend a lot of books, even if they are not the ideal reading material. Some of the books that I would mention, I would like the students to go through them so that they are aware of the industry practice. Now we have everybody, all of us grew up reading Tijoriwala, which is good for beginners because it demystifies a deed of conveyance. A deed of conveyance is one of the most format oriented documents, and even I'm scared to disturb the format because ultimately the price for intermeddling with being creative with a deed of conveyance is not going to be paid by me, it's going to be paid by a client. But there is some excellent material coming from other jurisdictions, and I would like to particularly mention Garner. I have, thanks to the lockdown, I was able to read Garner's book on Garner on language and writing. It's a must. I would really like everybody to get this book. The reason why I like this book is, it's one thing to say that let's give up all the unnecessarily unnecessary verbiage. Let's not make our documents prolix. But nobody comes up with tips as to how to go about doing it. So it is in this book that you find tips on how to make your life simple. And the beauty of the book is the tips given here will not only help you write better documents, draft better contracts, but it will help you draft more effective opinions. If you are interested in litigation, there are quite a few tips given by Garner for litigation too. Plus, it has come to my notice that students find it, or all of us, advocate students, you find it very difficult to use punctuations correctly. Sometimes you know, your clause need not be one long paragraph of 30 words if you knew how to use punctuations correctly. For use of punctuations, I mean, I would really recommend, and a lot of judges have, after they retired, and especially English judges, took to writing. And I would definitely recommend the books that they authored in their post-retirement. One of them is Henry Cecil. I've just finished reading. Obviously, the lockdown gave me a lot of opportunity to catch up on my reading. So I've just finished reading one of his books. Now, the advantage of reading, say, Henry Cecil or Panic or Denning is that you not only do you spruce up your language, you not only do you acquire a style in writing, but a lot of your basic principles in law get brushed. So you learn the art of having shorter sentences, more crisper sentences. There is no rule against starting your sentence with an injunction like and or for. If it adds clarity to your document, why not? You learn things such as I said, the word shall is a very deceiving word. In different contexts, it can mean something different. The word extend to. So if you supposing, let me give you an example of the word extend. The occupant, the lessee shall extend the structure for which the lessor shall extend all cooperation, and if the lessee is not able to extend the structure within the stipulated time, the lessor shall extend the time period, and for such extension no additional compensation shall be payable. Now, firstly, the word extend has been used in one sentence in three different contexts. Firstly, it has been used to indicate extension of space. Then it has been used to indicate rendering of cooperation. Then it has been used to indicate extension of time. And finally, when the draft person sums it up and says for such extension. So does that mean for extension of structure, no additional compensation shall be payable? Or does that mean for extension of time, no additional compensation shall be payable? So when you use one particular word, I mean, there are words which, you can't help it. English is an idiomatic language. But in drafting, when you use one particular word in a particular sense, stick to it. It is not a test of your vocabulary. Throughout the document, use that particular word in that particular sense alone, so that there is no inconsistency. There are no issues of interpretation of documents. I've given you example of, and you'll find many such examples. Garner himself has given the example of the same. When we all grew up, we learned pronouns, and I remember as children, learning pronouns and gerunds, and it was a task. Why use the word the same when you can use definite article the, when you can use the pronoun they, when you can. So tips like these is what you will end up taking from books and documents written by authors in other jurisdictions, because there the demand for plain language and the entire movement for plain language has a very strong momentum right now.
So you would recommend, say, English authors for the quality of the language and I guess Ghana's is the Ghana's modern usage. If you can just put up the book on the screen so some of our viewers can see the book. Right.
Yeah, it's Garner on language and
And right.
writing. But Garner has written extensively. I mean, this particular book talks about everything, you know, right from litigation drafting to judicial opinions to drafting of transactional documents. But there is another book by Garner which talks only about briefs. What and it's a it's designed like a textbook with large margins so that the reader, and I think it is aimed at students, the reader can make notes in the margins at for reference at a later date. And once you have a book like that, it's a lifelong investment because Garner himself has gone ahead and given a list of recommended reading. So when I was going through the list, I realized that even I realized why he has chosen those very books. Now, take for example Henry Cecil. I didn't have to pick up the dictionary even once to understand, what I didn't come across a word which was difficult, or it was written in it was written in plain English, lovely short sentences, beautifully punctuated. But for example, if you read, okay, War and Peace is a epic novel. Everybody in free time would like to read it. I often joke with my husband that if I die, he will have so much time on his hands that he can finally read the War and Peace and maybe write one. But the thing is, not to, I mean, these are classics, there is no doubt about it, but you end up picking up the wrong style. So it's very difficult, it's very important for you to read the correct type of literature. And one of the tips that Garner has given is that often we are not able to write effectively because we are not in the habit of writing. So what he has suggested, he has made a suggestion that each one should maintain a diary. Once you start maintaining a diary, every night you write a couple of things. Over a period of time, you can see how your writing has changed. That's one of the advantages of maintaining a diary.
Be homework from an associate end of writing a short summary or a diary on a daily basis, which will improve the quality of your writing, whether by way of transaction, as Divya has put it, or even in opinions, for which you need to refer to good books like Garner's. I'm sure Divya will give a whole list of other books at the end of the session, which is recommended for all lawyers. I guess my humble plea is please refer to these books. They are, if you are serious about your practice, they are critical to your progress as a lawyer.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, you can be creative. So, for example, you can read the deeds and documents by the Waker. You can read whatever the textbook books that you come across in all law chambers. And then you can be creative in the sense that, there was a time when a typical deed of conveyance read like one big paragraph. Now, these days, people have become creative. They have started splitting the long winding paragraph. So where you're giving the covenants against covenant for say quiet and peaceful enjoyment of the property, you mention it as covenant for quiet, and because the paragraph that follows is very wordy. Then when you're taking from the seller an indemnity against former titles or against any encumbrances, you caption it as seller's indemnity. You remember, your client is not, even advocates find it difficult to read all this mishmash of legalese. So now, one of the best books to understand, to have your deed of conveyance demystified is, say, a Tijori Wala. But he never advises having your documents captioned. That you will learn maybe from a Garner. Let me give you example of another excellent book for precedents. It's Butterworth's. It reads like a piece of wonderful legal literature. So, and the fact that it comes from, it discusses practices in England helps. So, for example, if you are, your each and every document, especially real estate document, need not be in the nature of, party of the first part and party of the second part. Now, if you're doing a serviced office agreement, for example, or a co-working space agreement, and your client is and these documents don't have any scope for negotiations. You go to a co-working space operator and you tell him that I'm taking, I'm booking this cabin, this particular table, so on and so forth. So these kind of documents that are coming out, they are in the form of a unilateral contract where the owner is just listing out the obligations and the duties of the person who's going to occupy the property, and he's given his certain covenants. So in this case, as I said, the word shall, the word shall can mean discretion, but when you use the word must means nothing but an obligation. So these kind of unilateral contracts, where the one party is, of course, see, if you're dealing with somebody who is in an equal bargaining position, then they may get slighted. And I've seen, in India, everybody gets slighted over words. So in fact, maybe it's a universal feature. I came across this beautiful quote by Lord Mansfield, which said that most of the disputes in the world arise from words. In any case, so you need not, you can have a very simple form, which is which is in the form of a letter. Take, for example, employment contracts. Most employment contracts too can be in the form of a letter where the obligations are of the of the employees are written in a nice crisp fashion. You use the word expression must rather than shall, so that there is absolute clarity as to what is a obligation, what is an obligation without any deviations, and you similarly you capture the obligations of the entitlements. Use the word, if somebody is entitled to something, use the expression that the employee is entitled to so many days of leave, he's entitled. So these are the kind of ideas that are coming up from that are coming from other jurisdiction. But if you would have gone through the any copy of Butterworth's way back, Butterworth's had made this suggestion that if you're the landlord, obviously you have a lot of property and you have a common contract for all your tenants. There was a time when nobody would think of opening up an office without Butterworth's. I think somewhere along the line, with the advent of internet and everything, it was no longer fashionable to talk about Butterworth's. But Garner is quite a phenomenon. If you go to YouTube, you see a lot of his, he talks a lot on drafting, on use of simple language. Another thing I would like advocates to do is watch debates on YouTube. And if need be, watch even Indian parliamentary debates are excellent. I had the opportunity of listening to Dr. Shashi Tharoor, and it was such a pleasure because, there you will pick up tips on how to make your case convincing or how to make your draft convincing. And let me give you another example. When I was talking about what to capture in background and recitals, it is very important, for example, when we capture representations. Now, in representations, there is a very high, the threshold that a lawyer has to meet to say that there is a misrepresentation is very high. So you cannot just get away with, supposing your permission of CIDCO is required for development of your property or for selling your property or your apartment to a third party. You cannot just say that, oh, I had taken a representation and somehow I got the document registered, because it is a fact that is, well, there is no such thing as statutory estoppel. It is a fact that everybody knows that, even ordinary due diligence, through ordinary due diligence, the person interested in the property could have found out that CIDCO's permission or MMRDA's permission is required for dealing with the property. In such cases, the authority's NOC should be a condition precedent, and you insist that it's a condition precedent. And it is for this reason we have multiple documents. You don't go on to the sale directly. You have a term sheet. The reason why you have term sheet or a MOU is so that these condition precedents can be fulfilled before you enter into a definitive agreement. But there are certain things you cannot find out even with, you cannot cover in a due diligence everything under the ecosystem. One of such things is litigation, whether the party is is solvent or not, and the question of solvency is becoming very important because of we have a lot of new laws such as the this insolvency and bankruptcy code. You have where your property can just be taken away. A committee of COC can be appointed. So all these, even your representation should be very, you have to think through as to what to include and what not to include.
Divya, now that we've discussed the requirements of, say, a development agreement, can you also share some tips on what a person should look for in other types of agreements, say maybe wills, because that's a place where a lot of people are making mistakes. Again, like to summarize what you have said, very important to use the language and not cut paste.
Oh yes, I mean, as I said, I gave the example of effective date because it was live and fresh. It is something I had to deal with during this lockdown, and it's if I were the drafts person, I would have really killed myself. In a simple leave and license agreement for the tenure not to come through clearly is really terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Talking about wills, I have come across wills. There are a lot of precedents on the net. Please, and then sometimes people are, penny wise but pound foolish. They spend, they decide to draft their wills all by themselves or consult a chartered accountant. Nothing wrong with that, but if you have a problem with your electricity, you don't go to a plumber and then say that the plumber didn't do a good job. So I have come across wills where there is no executor, where there's an arbitration clause, where there is a tenanted property and the testator says that I give and bequeath my tenanted property so and so to my eldest son so and so. Tenancy is not a inheritable right. Tenancy is not something you can transfer at will. You can at the most give directions to your landlord to transfer the rent receipt to your son, and if the son is not staying with you at the time of your death, rest assured that the flat is as good as lost. You have to sit down and, I'm a big fan of checklists, whether it is a will or a development agreement or a leave and license agreement or an agreement for sale, whichever document you're working on, have a checklist in place. When I started my career, I had a Word folder on my desktop. It said clauses, and any clause that I like, I would put it in that particular folder. So over a period of time, you develop checklists. In a checklist for wills you will of course mention the general background, the age and everything. You will definitely mention appointment of executors. You'll describe your family. You make a list of your properties and have the concepts cleared. Unfortunately, there was a lot of confusion regarding nomination right of a nominee in a cooperative housing society. The confusion started because there was a case from the Calcutta High Court which went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that the nomination overrides the will. Now remember, the real estate, immovable property, cooperative society act, all these there are different state laws operating on these subjects. So what may be true of of West Bengal will not be true of Maharashtra as far as the Maharashtra Cooperative Societies Act is concerned. If you make a nomination, what the society will transfer the shares to the nominee, but the nominee does not become the owner of the flat. The nominee holds the shares in trust for the actual beneficiaries. Now, when you list out the beneficiaries in your will, make sure that you must, the testator is bound to have the will attested by two witnesses. But it has come to our notice that one of the attesting witness is the spouse of the beneficiary. What happens in such a case? The bequest falls through, then there is no residuary legatee clause. Now, residuary legatee clause is extremely vital, because you may make a will today and die 5 years later. During this period, you must have acquired property. There must be additions, subtractions. So if you don't have a residuary legatee clause, then as far as properties which you have not specifically mentioned, and and given the bequest to an A person, it will be held that as far as those properties are concerned, it's a case of intestacy. Then there is a lot of confusion which arises from the vagueness of expressions used. Let me give you, I came across a will where the testator kept on writing, I wish to bequeath so and so thing, especially my jewelry to my eldest daughter. At the end of the day, when you use the expression, I wish to bequeath, is just a wish. There is no actual bequest. So in all legal documents, please don't use words such as I wish, I would give, grant. If you're making if it's a testament, then say I bequeath and bequest. If it's I devise, would give, will give, all these are just expressions of wishful thinking. Nothing turns on them. Then, as I said, be thorough with your Transfer of Property Act, your Indian Succession Act. If you're drafting a will, there's no harm in picking up the Indian Succession Act and just going through some of the basic provisions and sections dealing with wills. There's a rule against bequest in perpetuity. You can't just say that, leave a will and say that nobody can deal with my with a particular property forever. Properties cannot lie in limbo just like that. So whichever document it is, there's no harm in first reading up the law on that particular document and then sitting down and drafting.
Thank you, Divya. That was a very critical statement, because typically a lot of associates, when you're asked to draft something, quickly look for a precedent online and quick cut paste. But invariably, a critical portion of not referring to the law hampers the final document quality.
I mean, one case where I like to discuss, because it's become a bit of a, maybe it's become a blind spot with me, because I have come across it so many times. A lot of draftspersons are using the word penalty when what they mean is liquidated damages. I feel they feel that penalty sounds like a more stringent expression. They feel that using the word penalty would make the document tighter, which is not the case. On the contrary, if you read section 73 of the Indian Contract Act, law and section, and if you look at a lot of even if you look at the latest, the Specific Relief Act was overhauled in 2018. And if you look at the relevant judgments pronounced by the Supreme Court, what the courts have held, that when you term a sum as penalty, the courts have a discretion whether to grant you that particular amount by way of compensation or not. It is for the court to decide. So the penalty amount expressed or mentioned in the document is the maximum. However, if you use the expression liquidated damages, or if you use the expression this is a pre-estimate arrived at between the parties, and the parties feel this amount is reasonable and this amount is by way of liquidated damages, then the courts are bound to grant that particular amount mentioned in the document as compensation. But in documents of the documents, I have come across the word penalty when what is really meant is liquidated damages.
What you're typically saying is words are used interchangeably, one in place of the other, without realizing the impact or the import of it in a document.
Oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Which you feel are being, people are liberally interchanging. Which are the other words which you feel which people are Misuse.
using without knowing what it really means. I can think of penalty and liquidated damages because it's something that fantastic number of documents I've come across with this kind of mistake. Then another mistake which is very fundamental that I've come across is people feel that going back to the development agreement, when you say that under say the owner of the property hereby grants development rights to the developer instead of, and see, in real estate document the actual grant, the vesting of the property should be it should be conclusive. However, in a lot of development agreements, the expression used is not straight to the point. Grant, the expression used is the owner agrees to grant the development rights to the developer. The minute you say agrees to grant, you open up a can of worms. You leave it to the floor to decide whether the development agreement is really a grant, whether it's a concluded contract or the grant of the development rights is yet to take place. So in real estate documents, as I said, the vesting of property by one person to another should come out very clearly. Now take, for example, force majeure clauses. A lot of our leave and license agreements have force majeure clauses, but as somebody said that they are, the force majeure clauses usually found under the caption miscellaneous, and it is treated like a miscellaneous clause. Now, I think after this pandemic, it won't be a miscellaneous clause. Now, what happens there? What people write, people just think of in a lease agreement or a leave and license agreement of money. So that is important. See, if you are negotiating a force majeure clause and you don't specifically state that the payment of rent shall abate or payment of common area maintenance charges shall abate during the lockdown period or during the subsistence of the force majeure, then it will be applicable, because monetary non-payment is never, the courts don't recognize payment obligations as something which can be affected by force majeure, especially in the context of real estate. If you are a builder and you have to construct the building, there's a lockdown, you can say, okay, I need time and for delivery of possession because of force majeure. But as a tenant, unless your document specifically states that during the force majeure event you won't pay the landlord the rent, you're bound to pay it. But at the same time, there will be n number of other obligations. Now, you're not in your force majeure contract going to list out all the, in your force majeure contract, going to list out all the obligations. In such cases, it would be better to state that fine, rent and CAM or whatever monetary amounts you can identify, you can have a specific mention of the monetary amounts. Plus, you need to write that any other obligation which is affected by the force majeure event shall be waived or an extension shall be granted. Why? Because it may so happen that the force majeure event occurred during your fit out period. So you could not fit out the, renovate your place to your liking. Now in such an event, the minute, supposing your fit out period is that of say 45 days, which is the industry practice. On the 46th day, you have to start paying rent. You cannot seek an extension of the rent-free period. Plus, your fit-out work is still not done. So, therefore, you have a generic clause saying that those obligations which are affected by the occurrence of the force majeure event would accordingly, waived, or parties would look into it. Then again, a force majeure event need not lead to termination. People are not interested in really terminating contract. See, for everything, if you have the only security you have, which is termination, it's not going to help, because what happens in termination? Your security deposit is in the hands of your licensor. So instead you have to come up with a solution. Usually you come up with a period. You say that, okay, 6 months we can wait. If the situation hasn't improved in 6 months, then and whose stake is greater? I would say in commercial the documents, the stake of the uh, licensee is greater, so that let the licensee have the option whether to continue with the leave and license agreement or not. After all, he has spent money on fit outs. The security deposit is in the hands of the licensor. Then again, at the time of handover, sometimes you come across document where the only hold that the licensee has on the licensor against refund of, for refund of security deposit is staying over in the premises. That doesn't help, because if you're a responsible corporate, you have already on the last day made arrangements for exiting and handing over of the premises. So the right to stay over in the premises till the refund should be coupled with the right to collect interest if the default interest of the security deposit is not refunded in time. Same goes for your development agreements. A lot of agreements that we come across are not, people, you can make out that people have not thought things through. I'll give you an example of a development agreement so joint development agreement, all the revenue had to be deposited into an escrow account, and the parties decided once the money is deposited in this particular escrow account, withdrawals would be made for certain expenses, which the parties would sit across the table and apportion as per their understanding. However, nobody thought of a situation that one of the parties, just to harass another person, may refuse to sign the checks, may refuse to. So what do you do if your clause does not have a, say, does not specify that in such an event, you does not specify timelines that the other party shall wait for, say, 15 days, 20 days for the consent of the consent to come through. If the consent does not come through, then he should be entitled to proceed with the transaction as he deems fit. What has come to my notice that in increasing number of documents, there are just no timelines.
Divya, are there in addition to these real estate documents, can you throw light on the correct drafting, if possible, on litigation documents too?
I would suggest that we have this this in a series because see, litigation is not my area of expertise.
Sure, sure.
But one thing I should, in my limited experience, I've come across the fact that you have a synopsis. Synopsis is, left to the stenographers. Advocates don't even think that synopsis is something they should pay attention to. Mm-hmm. Now, synopsis, if your synopsis is nice and crisp, you have the issue, put your issue upfront so that when you're making the life of this judge simpler. You don't just have the surface issue. In 70 words, you write what capture the background, why the parties have come to the court, what is the issue that the court needs to address, and what is the relief you are seeking. That should come out clearly in your synopsis. Now, you have a very wordy title clause in your plaint, and then you go on to say, it is the plaintiff hereby submits that. And throughout the document, the plaintiff submits, the defendant, you get tired. Once you can, put a caption that the plaintiff says that this is your plaint, the judge knows that this document is not a document where the defendant is going to have his say. Then when you build up your case, put the strongest point first. First, we have the introductory paragraph, which gives everybody a good idea of what's about to come. They were old-time advocates feel that you should not color the mind of the judge by putting captions and subheadings, but that was a time when there hardly anybody went to the court. Today, a judge has to decide, I don't know how many cases per day. You think of yourself as the judge rather than as a litigant, and see how a document should be drafted. You give 100 pages without captions. I mean, is it really humanly possible? When you are seeking interim relief, make a case that it's irreparable loss, balance of convenience, and just don't put balance of convenience and irreparable loss in the concluding paragraph because it's a formality. your entire case, your entire application should be such that the fact that you will be put to really irreparable loss comes out clearly. As far as arbitration is concerned, and especially in arbitration and leave-in license agreement, I will share with Lee two judgments, one judgment actually, of the Bombay High Court, which refers to the Supreme Court judgments, and that should sort the matter. It is called Corona versus Sumangal Holdings. It's a, I think, 2007 or 6 Bombay High Court judgment. But as far as leases are concerned, in Vidya Dorolia, Justice Nariman had made a reference. So a 2017 judgment was held to be per incurem, and Justice Nariman has referred the ratio of Himangani to a larger bench, Vidya Dorolia, and that final judgment is still expected. So that is as far as your arbitration is concerned. I've just read there is a judgment. There are a lot of articles that you will come across. If you do a Google search on which list out the judgments pronounced by Supreme Court where an arbitration clause is not applicable. So if you read, for example, Booz Allen Hamilton, you will realize that for enforcement of a mortgage, an arbitration is not, tenable arbitration clause. Now, remember, we are talking about enforcement of mortgage, where the mortgagee is not a bank. Because if your mortgage is a bank, then you have a whole lot of special acts like SARFAESI, DRT in your favor. So when you read these, these judgments, be a little bit careful. The other question that somebody asked is regarding transfer of SRA properties. See, in the applicable DCR under the old DCR rules were 3310. Under 3310, you cannot, as far as the new property is concerned, the rehabilitated portion. So the rehab portion cannot be transferred by the allottee for a period of 10 years. So you don't make these transfer documents which are not, which shall be void in law and get your clients in trouble. Same goes for old and cess buildings. When old and cess buildings are redeveloped, then the tenant who is who is given new premises cannot sell his premises for a period of 10 years. Because after all, these are statutory benefits that have been given to the occupants or tenants or, slum dwellers. And what people, the legislation feel that these beneficial legislation should not be misused, and you should not speculate in real estate. It is given to make sure you have a roof over your head, not to profit from, from such. Tips on drafting of partnership deed and also modification of partnership deed. Partnership deed, I would suggest that, if you're doing an LLP, have a look at the LLP Act itself, have a look at some of the acts have given a standard format. Make sure that you have ample protection. So there are certain good faith duties that a partner, see, the partner can really land you in trouble. So you have to be very careful, take certain indemnities, take exhaustive representations, take covenants from your partner. Some of these covenants flow from the act itself, that, to do business in good faith, not to not to compromise a suit, not to make the partner liable and not to go beyond his, beyond the scope of the partnership. Have a well thought out arbitration clause, because sparring between partners is very common. You need to consult your chartered accountant as to how to do tax planning, because and remember, a partnership agreement too can have a high stamp duty implications if one of the partners is bringing into the partnership real estate. So if if you do a partnership and you say that I'm bringing into my partnership the office premises, you'll have to pay stamp duty on it as if it were a conveyance. So be very careful with the language used. If you do a joint venture agreement, for example, and you bring in Similarly, you bring in the immovable property as your contribution. Again, it can be stamped as conveyance. So this is one area where the chartered accountants and the lawyers have to sit together, unless, of course, your lawyer is also a tax practitioner. Have a very clear, as far as dissolution is concerned, as far as retirement is concerned, especially see in a partnership, a lot of instances happen because see, partnership is between families or partnership is between friends, and it does not have perpetual existence. So after the death of the partner, what will be the scheme of things? How all these things you have to think through. Otherwise, I recently did a property and we put out a public notice. Sure enough, the objection was from the heirs of the one of the deceased partners. So yes, somebody has asked whether junior advocates don't get time to, they don't get to be part of the negotiations. A lot of times it happens that the juniors are made to draft without them being a part of the transaction negotiations, or client calls due to confidentiality issues. How do we tackle such situations? Well, I would say you just wait until you grow up. Or a lot of seniors, when we come across very keen and hardworking juniors, we make it a point to at least share the final draft with the with the juniors, because ultimately we want them to do well and take burden off our shoulders and independently handle transactions. So it all depends on how much how diligent you there is a testing period for everybody. So how diligent, what kind of level of diligence you show in your testing period? Yes, first of all, I would like everybody to read Garner, read books on drafting, read excellent authors, read Denning, read Henry Cecil, read McGarry, read Panic, and of course read all the read Butterworth. Secondly, it's not enough. Good language is not enough. It's important to have a style, but that's not enough. We need to understand the law at least, and I agree that in this day and age, it is maybe impossible to know all the statutes, all the laws under the ecosystem. Certain principles of equity, the first principle should be in place. Yes, and that's it. Effective drafting is about having your concepts right, and having your concepts right, and good, nice, crisp language. And I'm sure with hard work, you can achieve what you want. The nice thing about law is nobody is a lawyer. All of us are students. All of us are students. Every day is a learning. Now, let me give an example of the Specific Relief Act. The Specific Relief Act was overhauled in 2018. Yet we come across documents which are structured on the basis of the earlier act, where it was very, where you could not seek specific relief as a matter of right. Specific relief it was left to the courts to give the specific relief that a party or a plaintiff sought. So it's meaningless to have such forward-looking legislation if the advocates are not going to change. I mean, because of the amendments to the Specific Relief Act, we, in the ease of doing business ratings, India notched up 20 places in a year, because the government could show that we have spruced up the laws regarding enforcement of contracts. As far as statutes are concerned, it may be you had SICA at one time, you have IBC right now. It may be a question, languages do evolve. One term which was understood in a particular manner 10 years ago is not interpreted in the same fashion today. So, and unfortunately, we have so many, you have live law, live law has a weekly, every Friday, it sums up all the important judgments given by the Supreme Court. It's on television, on internet. We have the bar and the bench. We have n number of Legal Era comes up with, and all these services are free. You don't even have to subscribe to their only to read the whole text of the judgment, you have to subscribe to these magazines. Practical Lawyer, I have subscribed to Practical Lawyer, the magazine, and I find it excellent, excellent. Even the articles are very relevant. See, a lot of disputes in contracts are going to come from your personal data protection bill. So you need to be updated with what the bill is all about. If you are doing a sort of a fintech kind of contract, as I said, in these contracts, people, when you go to a website, supposing you go to an XYZ platform, it's an e-platform. The person who owns the platform or has made the platform available to you don't even know who you are. So when you are drafting a document, it can be a document in the form of a sort of a list of obligations and list of letters. Make it small, list of performances, make it small and concise. So we have to keep up not only with the changes in law, but also with the change in business environment and practices. And that's what I like about this profession. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, you're still, all of us are students. The day we stop being a student is the day we stop growing. That's the time we die. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.